So the idea, you can think about this as a bootstrapping process in some sense. Is in order for anything to get going, it has to bootstrap itself up and become more and more complex as it does that. So it's like, this is the answer to the chicken and egg problem, right? Which was first, the chicken or the egg? Well, neither. Something from which both the chicken and egg were derived, right? Because the ultimate answer to that is the answer to how there are things at all. Who knows? But at some point there were neither chickens nor eggs, but there were the things that were the precursors to those things. And so they spiraled upwards in some sense, and those initial proto-entities, single-celled animals for, I mean, you can go back farther than that, but we could say, well, single-cell animals differentiated over time, right? And there's this looping process that differentiates out into both the chicken and the egg. So, but what the question is, what do you need in order for that process to begin? And that's really the question of what the fundamental constituent elements of reality are. And the mythological hypothesis is that there's three or four. One is the fact that there has to be something that manifests itself as an observer. It's something like that. Some kind of observer. Now, where that process of observation starts in the phylogenetic chain is very, very difficult to tell. You know, we might say, well, there's certainly no possibility of a conscious observer until there's a differentiated nervous system. But then prior to the emergence of differentiated nervous systems, there were animals that were complex enough to react with the environment in a manner that, well, single-celled animals, they're quite complex. I mean, some of them are unbelievably complicated, you know. They can move themselves through space, they can orient, they can follow chemical trails. They're not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. Now, to what degree they have being, you know, as something they can represent, well, we don't have to speculate on that, but the proto-elements of conscious being are there. So you need a being, you need the structure of that being through which the entirety of being itself is interpreted, and you need the surround. It's something like that. And so I conceptualize that as something that knows, that's the knower, what it knows, that's the interpretive structure, and that which needs to be known. Or you could conceptualize that as the individual in explored territory nested inside unexplored territory. That's another way of thinking about it. Or you can think about it as the individual inside culture and the individual culture as nested inside nature. That's another way of looking at it. Or you can think of it as the knower and in order surrounded by chaos. That's another way of thinking about it. But all these things, you know, they're all attempts to articulate the same underlying structure. You see that in narratives continually, and I think Pinocchio is a very good example of that, because in Pinocchio you have the culture, that's Geppetto, and Geppetto is obviously creative but also insufficient and dead, which is why he ends up in the belly of the whale. You have the blue fairy, who's Mother Nature for all intents and purposes. The negative feminine doesn't manifest itself much in the Pinocchio story, except implicitly in the form of the whale, the thing at the bottom, which is more like the dragon of chaos than something feminine, that swallows up culture. But you have nature, or culture, Geppetto, nature, the blue fairy, and then the puppet, Pinocchio. And, you know, from a strictly scientific perspective, we think of human beings as nothing but the children of nature and culture, and that pushes you towards a kind of deterministic view. What causes your behavior? Well, it's either nature or culture, because there isn't anything else. But that isn't how the mythological story lays itself out, because it says there is something else, and that's whatever your consciousness is. And that consciousness seems to be able to work with nature and culture in a non-deterministic manner in order to bring, well, in order for what? In order to bring itself forward. I mean, and that's really, and what's interesting about that, I think, is that it isn't obviously just the plot of Pinocchio. It's virtually the plot of any story, is the story of the development of the individual. Now, the story is order, chaos, higher order, roughly speaking. So you can get variants of that. You can get order collapses into disorder and nothing is resolved. That's a tragedy, right? And you can get, so you don't have to have the entire story represented in a story, but you get fragments of it. It's a classic U-shaped story. And what it is the story of the development of the individual across time. So you can say, well, where does human structure come from? The sense data. That's sort of the blank slate idea. It's like, no, wrong, because a blank slate cannot process information. You're actively engaged right at the beginning. So that's another example of the knower and the unknown, you know, working in this cyclical manner, because you interact with something, you divide it up into you and the world, roughly speaking, and I mean you really make it that way because you build yourself out of the information, and then of course that makes you a more differentiated processor with a broader range of skills. Then you interact with the unknown again, you gather more information, it differentiates the world, it makes you a more differentiated harvester, and then so it's just continually cycling. And that consciousness, the logos, the knower, is that thing that's doing that harvesting, and you can never say it's not there. Now what happens is that it's in its nascent form to begin with, low resolution nascent form. Low resolution knower, low resolution category system, low resolution world. But that's enough to kickstart it and to start it differentiating, and that happens as you develop as an individual, because you start out as a single-celled organism for all intents and purposes, a very low resolution thing in a very low resolution world, and that differentiates itself across time. But exactly the same thing happened over evolutionary time.